Hello, everybody. Hello. Nice to meet you. It's a great pleasure. I'm very glad to welcome all participators of our session, environmental and food ethics. But you know that a lot of reports are dedicated to ecofeminism. It means that this is also a very important part of our work today. You know that because of cancellations today, we have got only right now, second session will include 4 very interesting reports. I suppose that 4. First of all, I would like to invite to speech Marta Tafalla, Autonomous University of Barcelona, Spain. I like this city very much, and I know that your university is very, very strong in ecofeminism and environmental ethics here. Your topic will be about why animal ethics needs animal aesthetics. Please welcome. We are hearing attentively. Thank you.
Thank you, Katerina, for the introduction. I will try to share a PowerPoint. Let's see if I can. I think, yeah, you can see it, I think. Okay, so first of all, thank you to the organizers of the conference, and also thank you to everybody for being here with us. So the thesis I will define in this paper is that aesthetics is an important factor in our increasingly complex relationships with animals. Unfortunately, philosophy has paid little attention to the aesthetic appreciation of animals, as some philosophers have already denounced. Although several interesting publications have appeared recently, they are still insufficient to constitute an academic field of research in its own right. I claim that if we analyze our aesthetic appreciation of animals carefully, we will gain a deeper understanding of different cases of mistreatment and also discover more appropriate. I will give a brief list of examples of human activities that harm animals on the level of both individuals and species, and I will defend the idea that these cases are at least partly explained by a superficial aesthetics. And after that, I will claim that we should develop a critical theory of animal aesthetics that could offer us a systematic approach to our relationships with animals and help us find a fairer way of sharing the earth with them. So I begin with the aesthetic factor in some human activities that harm animals. And my first example is about forcing animals to perform against their nature. The magic of circus consists in the realization of acts that seem impossible, that break natural laws and create an atmosphere of fantasy. When they include animals, the shows try to fascinate the public by presenting wild animals acting in unexpected and astonishing ways. They are fierce wild animals, but they appear dressed in human clothes, they dance and prance like puppets to the rhythm of music, and they obey their masters as if they were enchanted creatures in a fairy tale. When animal rights groups use ethical arguments to denounce such activities, circuses often defend themselves with aesthetic and artistic arguments. They appeal to artistic freedom as a right to be respected, and also claim that circuses offer the public the possibility of watching beautiful exotic animals from faraway countries, and that animals are even embellished with costumes and makeup. Because circuses justify their practices with artistic and aesthetic arguments, I think we need to consider reflection on them. To begin with, I claim there is something aesthetically wrong with the way animals are exhibited in the circus. In the shows, animals are prevented from displaying their identity and natural behavior. They are forced to behave in ways so alien to their nature, and even so dangerous and painful, for example, a lion jumping through a ring of fire, or a tiger galloping on a horse, that it's inconceivable that the animals are able to understand why they are forced to act in these ways. Surely they only accept to do so because they are violently trained and become terrified. Moreover, they are often forced to behave in ways that symbolize human dominance of their species and that ridicule them in spectacles that aestheticize animal abuse and human supremacism. Circus animal shows prevent animals from behaving in a natural way, and likewise prevent people from aesthetically appreciating animals as they really are, which promotes ignorance about animals. My second example is about modifying the bodies of animals. According to the World Wildlife Fund, 20,000 African elephants are poached every year because some humans aesthetically appreciate their tusks, which are exhibited as if they were decorative objects and also often transfigured into figurines or jewelry. In countries such as Mozambique, hunting pressure has been extremely strong. During the recent civil war there, 90% of elephants were slaughtered and their ivory sold to finance weapons. Some elephants had a rare tuskless genetic trait and thanks to this had more possibilities of surviving. As a result, elephants in Mozambique are now evolving to lose their tusks. The same is happening in other countries where hunting pressure is high. In this case, human aesthetic tastes for an element of the body of elephants is provoking the loss of this element from their bodies. Scientists are currently researching how tusklessness affects the daily behavior of elephants, how it changes their feeding patterns, interaction with vegetation, and relation with other animal species. Elephants are poached for economic reasons, but also for aesthetic reasons, because there are enough people who want to possess and exhibit ivory ornaments which they judge to be beautiful, elegant, delicate, or pure. I maintain that to judge an ivory jewel as beautiful is a superficial appreciation, because it is considering the ivory piece as if it was a complete object, when in reality it is a broken fragment that has been violently torn from the body of a subject. My third example is about disrupting ecosystems. Following with the case of the ivory trade, scientists are now stating that poaching elephants has a huge impact not only on the bodies of elephants, indeed not only on their immediate environments, but globally. Research has revealed that the way African forest elephants feed results in an increase in the amount of carbon that forests are capable of storing. Elephants need high quantity food every day, and the way they select the vegetation they eat means that forests have fewer but larger trees, which are capable of storing more carbon. Because of this, the extinction of forest elephants would result in a 7% decrease in the above-ground biomass in Central African rainforests, which would exacerbate global warming. How can anyone still claim that an ivory jewel is glamorous? My next example is about spectators as obstacles, or at least the role of some spectators as obstacles. Wildlife watching tourism is a growing business that can have positive effects, such as educating people concerning the knowledge of animals, generating income that can be used towards conserving wild species and their environments, and creating jobs for local populations. Most of the people who travel to watch wild animals living free in their home environments probably aim to have aesthetic experiences of natural beauty. However, concentrations of tourists in a particular place and the way they behave can harm the very animals they wish to contemplate. Research has estimated the negative impact of tourism on cheetahs in Masai Mara in Kenya. The research found that tourist vehicles following cheetahs represent an obstacle to their daily life. It seems paradoxical that some tourists enjoy viewing animals in the wild so much that they get as close as possible and end up harming the very animals they wish to observe. How can we explain this contradictory behavior? Maybe the tourists do not fully understand that they are not watching a show for humans, but the real life of cheetahs? Whatever the case, I consider that this aesthetic appreciation of cheetahs, which harms them, is a mere superficial appreciation. And my last example is about extinguishing beauty. Animals are hunted and trafficked, dead or alive, for different reasons. Some species are hunted so that their dead bodies can be exhibited as ornamental objects, and others are hunted to be eaten as delicacies, and yet others are traded alive for public zoos, private collections, circuses, or to appear on TV shows. All the species that are hunted and trafficked for these reasons share a common element. They are aesthetically appealing to many humans. In some cases, these activities are pushing species to the brink of extinction. To offer some examples, the grey parrot is currently endangered because it has been massively hunted to be sold. Bluefin tuna is endangered because it is considered a gastronomic delicacy. It could seem that this only affects a few charismatic species, but in fact is a massive problem. Research shows that one in every five terrestrial vertebrate species is affected by some sort of trade, and indicates that wildlife trafficking is one of the principal causes of biodiversity loss. It also warns that this destruction is accelerating. Thanks to globalization and the internet, once trade in a species begins, it can become endangered in only a few years. The same research has also tried to list the characteristics that make species more susceptible to be trafficked, and most of them are qualities that are aesthetically appreciated. Singing and color in birds hunted to be caged, the size and form of horns in mammals hunted as trophies, and the color of reptiles and amphibians sold as pets. According to the researchers, by studying these criteria, it's possible to anticipate which species could be trafficked in the future when the species not being traded become extinct. So we could affirm that our aesthetic tastes can be deadly for wildlife. So my thesis is that developing a critical theory of animal aesthetics could help us to analyze the cases of animal abuse enumerated in the previous section and many others. We need to become aware of the aesthetic factor in our relationships with animals and learn to examine it philosophically. As Stephen Davis has stated, it seems that the ways we aesthetically appreciate animals have their roots in our biological nature. But probably many aspects are cultural, since it's possible to detect differences between groups of people, and because tastes and attitudes can be changed by education, as we can all experience in our own lives. If we examine the aesthetic factor in our relationships with animals, we should come to understand our behavior towards them better, and I hope this knowledge will inspire and promote attitudes of respect. Because we still do not have a theory of animal aesthetics to work with, we urgently need to build one. To begin such a project, I think the first necessary step is to develop the difference between a superficial and a deep aesthetic appreciation of animals. In his seminal paper, Contemporary Aesthetics and the Neglect of Natural Beauty, Ronald Hepburn declared that we should differentiate between shallow appreciations of natural environments and serious ones. Although Hepburn did not explicitly apply this idea to animals, I defend the claim that it's as necessary for animals as it is for environments. Criteria to differentiate between superficial and deep aesthetic appreciation of animals, I propose the cognitive aesthetics theory developed by Alan Carlson in books such as Aesthetics and the Environment. Carlson affirms that aesthetic appreciation is a cognitive activity, but the kind of knowledge necessary to aesthetically appreciate an object depends on the kind of object in question. So if we want to appreciate works of art, we need the knowledge provided by history and philosophy of art. Whereas if we aim to appreciate natural environments, we need the knowledge provided by natural science. This means that appreciating natural environments is not a matter of simply finding delight in images, sounds, and smells. It is the knowledge of the elements that conform a natural environment, the functions each one performs, and the relations between them that will lead us to enjoy a deep aesthetic appreciation of it. Carlson has written mostly about environments, but in one of his latest books, he also briefly focused on animals. In Functional Beauty, co-authored by Glenn Parsons, the authors argue that the aesthetic appreciation of animals should not be the appreciation of a sensuous surface, of a pattern of forms and colors, but it should include the knowledge necessary to understand the connections between the animal's appearance and their nature and behavior. I agree with Parsons and Carlson's idea that the aesthetic appreciation of animals needs to relate their appearance to their nature. To work with this idea, I propose the concept of way of living, to include all the features that characterize a species, from anatomy to behavior. Every species has its own particular way of living. The elements of their appearance that may delight our senses have the roles to play in the way animals live. I could even say that the appearance of a species is the sensory manifestation of a way of living. Way of living is a concept that applies at the species level, but when we appreciate an animal, we are not only appreciating a member of a species, but a particular individual. In most species, there is considerable diversity between the capacities and personalities of the individuals, and in every case, each individual animal has his or her own personal story. When we focus on individuals, we need to understand that inside the body and the appearance that we aesthetically appreciate, there is a subject who experiences life from a subjective point of view, who feels pain and pleasure, who feels joy when life is fine, and becomes sad and scared when life goes wrong. In many species, the individuals maintain social relationships and friendships and have their own desires and memories. Of course, the degree of consciousness and self-consciousness varies from species to species, but rapid advances in the science of animal cognition show us that many species are more intelligent than we may have thought. This is precisely why appreciating animals is different from appreciating other natural elements like rivers, mountains, or trees. Animals offer us a kind of aesthetic experience that no other element can give us. They respond to us. With many species, when we look at them, they look back at us. The exchange of glances with a wild animal is one of the deepest aesthetic experiences we can have. But these inspiring experiences also imply great responsibility. It's easy to damage wild animals we encounter in natural environments, as we have seen in the previous section. We should approach them with great respect, maintaining physical distance and not disturbing them. Their lives are more important than our aesthetic experiences. In her recent article, Consumer Aesthetics and Environmental Ethics, Problems and Possibilities, philosopher Yuriko Saito sets out an interesting proposal which includes the concept of the story. Saito claims that we may find an object aesthetically appealing because of its appearance, but if we discover that the story of its production provoked environmental damage, that is a reason to change our aesthetic judgment concerning the object. If the production of a beautiful dress implies polluting a river, then the ugliness of the polluted waters diminishes the beauty of the dress. Saito says, and I quote, "People often become vegetarian not only for ethical reasons, but also on aesthetic grounds, after coming to know various harms done to the animals and the environment. They can no longer enjoy the taste of meat." Apply Carlson and Parsons' cognitive aesthetics and also Saito's concept of the story of an object, we will see that the ivory jewel or a fur coat may seem like beautiful objects only until we discover the stories of the objects, which led us to the stories of suffering caused to the animals. As soon as we know these stories, we will judge the ivory jewel or the fur coat to be ugly and repulsive. And the same will happen with the circus animal shows and the other cases of animal abuse I mentioned above. So, summarizing, we have a superficial and distorted aesthetic appreciation of animals when we only appreciate their external appearance or even only a fragment of their bodies, such as the plumage, fur, or horns, without relating this appearance to the animal's way of living. We have a shallow appreciation when we conceive the animal as an object that we can exhibit in a cage to adorn our home, or when we decide to modify an animal's body or behavior to please our aesthetic tastes. We should appreciate animals by taking into account relevant knowledge provided by natural science, and we should understand that every species has a way of living that links it to particular environments, and that every individual is a subject who feels pain and pleasure, has a personality and a personal story. In this way, we realize that enclosing animals in a cage and preventing them from displaying their way of living in their natural environment, or forcing them to perform in ways that contradict their nature, diminishes their beauty. Moreover, we understand that causing an animal suffering to create a jewel or cook a dish makes the resultant objects ugly and repellent. And because of all that, I claim that the aesthetic appreciation of animals should be based on scientific knowledge, but also on a critical philosophical reflection, on the permanent self-questioning about the origins and reasons of our aesthetic tastes and the impacts they may have on animal lives. This would imply a double cognitive task that could help us to overcome superficial appreciations and develop deeper and enriching ones. In this sense, I view the aesthetic appreciation of animals as a path of learning and discovery. So that's all. Thank you for your listening and your time.
Thank you so much for very, very relevant topic and discussion. This really report is very, very important. The next report is dedicated, it is a report of Sauka. We appreciate very much, Annie, that you expressed your agreement to be the second reporter today, changed your place. Thank you so much. Sauka works at the University of Latvia, and your report is dedicated to the topic bodies and the environment and ontogenealogical approach, ontogenealogical approach. Please welcome. We will hear attentively, please.
Yes, thank you. So I will share my screen now.
Please.
Yeah, I hope you see it. Okay, so I will the article, and I hope I will be in time. So bodies and the environment, an ontogenealogical approach. The way human body is conceived evidently co-produces the material embodiment. Conversely, materiality is also engaged in the way that our bodies are lived on a societal level. Thus, materiality cannot be viewed as a passive canvas for the expression of culture, but is rather a transformable and transformative site itself. Moreover, ontologies of the body also take part in the constitution of materialities outside of our bodies. Despite scholarly theorization and scientific evidence of a symbiotic and processual world, a materiaphobic view still reigns in the global north. And this attitude has resulted in the creation of a global wasteland. The objectification of materiality logically necessitates the objectification of ourselves, and worse, those that are othered as unworthy. And thus the exploitation and wasting of our surroundings refers back to the wasting and exploitation of people, once more evidencing the entanglement of bodies and environments on a material as well as an ontological level. In context of this bio-illogical and biopolitical body environment, I argue for a genealogical understanding of life itself, reconsidering the sphere of critical genealogy initiated by Michel Foucault with a materialist context. For this, I introduced the concept of ontogenealogy that refers to a transformative nature, cultured, and processual character of lived materialities, and explores the genealogical vertical axis and also the biopolitical horizontal axis of co-constituting lived materialities. Many theorists today have demonstrated a need for a shift in the dominating ontologies of the global north, for implementing a new ethical paradigm on the basis of a transcorporeal understanding of the self. Yet the potential of an experienced and effectual shift is still questionable. Here I go out from the assumption that if a serious effectual shift toward the non-anthropocentric processual ontology is possible, then it must be already present within our everyday experiences. In this particular article, I invite the consideration of the tie between the perceptions of the environment and the constitution of selfhood via Michael Marder's dumpology and Julia Kristeva's notion of abject, in the search for a shift in the dominating ontologies of the body that parallel with the dominating ontologies of the environment and are problematized in the context of the environmental crisis. Next to a critique of the domineering ontogenealogies, I also consider marginalized embodied ontogenealogies as possible vehicles for futuring a non-anthropocentric ethics, raising environmental awareness in local contexts, and evidence for the presence of alternate ontogenealogies. Dumped life, toxicity, and selfhood. In his recent book, Dump Philosophy, Michael Marder analyzes the world through the prism of dump. Most significantly, Marder highlights the parallelism of a global, undifferentiated, and indifferent dump and the metaphysical apathy of the contemporary philosophies that multiply multiplicities to the level where everything becomes equally involved in the same complexity and difference of homogeneity. While Marder endures a much-needed environmental and metaphysical critique, he leaves it an open question whether and how the global dump is connected with the metaphysical dump after God's death. It seems that the metaphysical dump is rather the reason why contemporary society is unable to differentiate and thus adequately analyze the situation it is left in, or even more probably that the metaphysical dump arises with the environmental dump, thus appropriately reflecting the new metaphysical reality one experiences. Is the environmental dump, however, a consequence of getting rid of the metaphysical ideals of the past, where above and below, feminine and masculine, object and subject are still clearly recognizable and differentiable with human as the between? That seems less believable, since regarding the environment as an expandable dump is a direct result of a long genealogy of alienation and materiaphobia that stifles humans' capacity to recognize the entanglement of bodies and environments within and without, and results in the intangibility of environmental embeddedness. It seems possible to conclude that the metaphysical dump instead demonstrates the fragility of individual that requires an equilibrium of both life-preserving and life-dispersing forces. The play of destructive and resurrective powers translates to Nietzsche's concepts of Dionysian and Apollonian, the flow and the structure. Instead of a dialectic interpretation, the two counterparts both strive towards a continuation of life, which necessitates both formations as well as dispersion and reproduction in other forms. The third element, the Socratic principle, however, brings forth a dialectics that is showcased both in the cancerous having orientation of today's consumerism, as well as in the objectified understanding of selfhood, and most importantly, in the production types and attitudes towards the environment in the global north. With the Socratic principle, Western civilization has appropriated the tension between powers of structure and change into the current alienated mode of flat and indestructible production. That which is non-destructible, as the global dump, following Marder's argumentation, is also negation itself, as it is never possible to become. The Socratic principle is thus the negation of itself, a self-contained dialectics of non-being. Marder uses the metaphor of tumor, similarly to the way in which Deleuze refers to the cancerous wish for transcendence as a characteristic of contemporary capitalism and its consumerist subject. The cancerous element represents the transhuman wish for transcendence that lives on within the neo-humanist transhumanisms and is exemplified by the resulting transformation of the earth into a heap of dung and the metaphysical undifferentiation. Translated again in Nietzsche's terms, the cancerous self-negation is equal to the Socratic element or rationality left without its counterpart, proliferating freely. In context with the ontogenealogies of the self and the environment, one sees within Marder's considerations an elaborate critique of the self-alienation that is mirrored in the alienation of the environment, and understandably so, since the body-environment codependency and coexistence necessitates that alienation of one is alienation of both. Thus, while the world turns into a global dump characterized by continuous production of the same, the undifferentiation does not refer to a refutation of dualism. Here, the materiophobia of the global north lives on, even in the form of a reverse dualism that does not accept a transcendental spiritual reality outside of the junk and dump of the life world. To secure an everlasting existence, the fragility of the self is still concealed by the objectification of the life world, in the final instance reaching to an objectification of the self. While the subject still wishes to control its bodily existence, this control today reaches all possible spheres of subjectivity itself. If A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, 1962, still awakens the feeling of uncanniness, the transformations of the body that is largely thought to be without agency beyond the controlling instance of consciousness do not attract the same seriousness of consideration. And since today, all that is human is thought to be the body, understood as a mechanical, transformable, and determinate mechanism, the use of chemicals for transforming consciousness has also become the new normal and is barely associated to the ideas transmitted in such dystopian views as the Clockwork Orange. Thus, self, while still maintaining the form of dualism and individual responsibility, is also throughoutly objectified, which is reflected in the environmental context of the dump, is simultaneously also experienced as all-pervasive. An equilibrium of becoming and having in the self-preservation and self-dispersion would acquire recognition of the ontogenealogical anthropocentrism of the human perception as a necessary piece of the maintenance of an ego, yet not the whole purpose or function of the enfleshed self. Yet today, this ego-centeredness has grown out of proportion, simultaneously also turning into its own negation by a reductionist and senseless mechanistic view of the human body and its surroundings. Thus, human-centeredness threatens to turn into its own negation, inviting human extinction. In the words of Gilles Deleuze, this is reflected by a reactive nihilism turning into a passive nihilism of human self-elimination that is also reflected in Nietzsche's figure of the last man and the end of history. In this way, human nature culture turns against itself by the alienation of the ego from its embeddedness of the variability that is its carnal body. The self-alienation achieved through the ego allows the self to perceive its own carnal manifoldedness and instability as an enemy for its continued existence. Hence, the human ego tries to control and transform the power of life experienced as the grounds for the instability and inevitable finitude of the ego's existence. Similarly, nature is also recognized as a natural enemy that requires control and transformation, an attitude that has evidently resulted in the global dump. Cancerous is hence a viable metaphor for the proliferation of the global dump site and the contemporary hoarding character of the human self alike, again exemplifying the parallelism between the ontogenealogies of the self and the ontogenealogies of the environment. Ontogenealogies have many beginnings, and hence the seemingly paradoxical coexistence of the deterministic undifferentiated differentiation and dualist dreams of transcendence both stem partly from the materiophobia and alienation of lived materialities, stifling the dance of the Dionysian and Apollonian elements by the Socratic principle of dialectic negation and self-objectification of the ratio that creates without the complementary counterpart of destruction, such as the cancerous reality of plastic waste exemplifies. Again, one is reminded of the material co-constitution of genealogies, since while materiophobia of the past is metaphoric and refers more consistently to attitudes and praxis toward oneself and the environment rather than a metaphysical structure of the world, today these attitudes and praxis have resulted in toxicity of the material plane and thus also in the toxicity of oneself. By the definition of the body environments as junk and foreign to the pureness of spirit, and the consequent stripping of spirit, first the body and then everything, the body environments have turned into junk in a very real sense, making it a self-fulfilling prophecy. The toxicity of the body environment assemblage can also be termed by Julia Kristeva's concept of abjection. Understood as an alienated entity, the environment is cast as abject. Abject for Kristeva is that which reminds the self of its fragility. Thus, for example, all liquids leaking from the porous body can be experienced as abject since they remind the self of its self-uncontainability and the blurring borders of the consciousness encapsulated within the sac of the skin. The notion of objectivity relates to Marder's conceptualization of the dump as neither object nor subject, but rather an undifferentiated mass of simultaneously alien as well as an incorporated leviathan of non-being. The processes considered and experienced as abject have historically immensely grown in number and amount since the industrialization of the global north has seen the urban environment to become more natural to the human being than the larger world it has come from. The wilderness today, while simultaneously existing only in periphery as a constructed haven of prehistorical bliss, is also abject to the integrity of selfhood, similarly to the bacterial world. And in some parts of the world, even the air that one breathes can be conceived via this notion. Pandemic, the air pollution also extends to airborne illnesses, and the possibility is already experienced as abject in certain conditions also globally. Thus, the attempts to purify oneself from the atrocity of the abject via chemical or technological means has rather ironically resulted in the pollution of oneself, the subject and the other understood as object, a result enabled by the inability to recognize the objective as a necessary attribute of the I, and alienating oneself from the preconscious and fleshed selfhood. In a paradoxical twist, we are also imagined as toxic to the nature itself, either demons or angels, but never in harmony with our surroundings. Materialization in the ontologies we live by thus extends to human-environment relations. Environmental problems such as climate change and the Great Extinction are nowadays often attributed to human exceptionalism, and ultimately to an understanding of subjectivity based on a substance ontology, for which change is problematic to conceptualize. That is, it often so that it often disappears from the socio-political scene or is encapsulated in a linear understanding of time. Ironically, the goal of a linear timeline is usually teleological, and thus a suspension of time, namely a cancerous dimension of having modality, which reminds of what Fromm conceptualizes as living in the mode of having, namely in a mode of self-preservation that fights against the passing of time while simultaneously striving to develop in a way that overcomes the immanence in time, ultimately stopping it. Given the conceptualization of enfleshed selfhoods as transspecies assemblages, or as processual becomings or transcorporealities, the consideration of porous bodies and subjectivities invites the consideration of the environment in an ethical context. How do the ontological presuppositions impact environmental ethicality, and how a revision of these presuppositions could change that ethical framework? Since individually experienced selfhood is already a transspecies assemblage, namely an experienced perpetual formation of becoming more than human, the question of environment breaches alienated conceptualizations and is exposed as interrelated with the ontological grounding of the self. Environmental ethics, hence, is not only theoretically but materially co-constituted with the constitution of selfhoods, and the way that self-realization and biopolitical processes transpire importantly impact the way environmental issues are dealt with and the way that the Umwelt is lived and materializes. This is exemplified by the human-bacterial relations that historically have changed in a very material way the ontogenealogical makeup of the self and the environment. Where the hygiene discourse since the 20th century has influenced the disappearance of some illnesses and the rise of others, especially in the context of the use of antibiotics, the inability to see bacterial configurations at all, as in the microscope, some constellations and enables others. As I tried to outline in the previous discussion, an equilibrium of self-preservation and dispersion might stifle a complete move away from anthropocentrism, since an anthropocentric outlook also upholds the conscious functioning of the human being. By being conscious of one already is self-centric, since a complete objective consciousness of the processual becoming of oneself as a trans-species assemblage would stifle any concrete consciousness of a self as a self. In short, to escape the heap of global dump, differentiation between self and the other is inescapably necessary, and with it, the objectification of the world also follows to some extent. Thus, the question of the viability of post-anthropocentric view ensues. Considering the immense impact of substance ontologies and their definite domination in socio-political spheres, it seems logical to assume that the disposition of the human self also requires substance ontological perspective, depending on the experience of our bodies, and thus all that is considered other as objects. That is so, however, only if one assumes the dominance of conscious processes and subjectivity as the factual controlling agency of a self. The conscious processes, however, do not exhaust what becoming human or becoming in general is. To seek a way out of the global dump, however, one can turn to already existing alternative structures that uphold the seemingly dominant materialities we live by. Thus, while the global dump seems all-pervasive, beyond it, the processes of the space-time still provide the space for becoming via the creation of destruction. Apollonian and Dionysian play of powers. Or else the cancerous structures would also be impossible. After all, cancer dies with the organism that carries it. Thus, a process ontology always already preconditions any possibility of substance ontologies, even if the consequences of the latter are more prominent in their toxicity. Similarly, the enfleshed selfhoods factually exist via their embedded and affectual preconscious bodies, while having the illusion of the mind as the controlling instance. A tentative answer to the question of whether post-anthropocentric views are possible to establish as a viable part of human cognition would state that some shifting is possible, but then one must seek for what is already out there, namely what kinds of connections are maybe already in place but go unnoticed due to the predominance of the leading ontogenealogies. A shift away from an anthropocentric view could be possible via the re-evaluation of what is considered abject and building affectual knowledge of what enfleshed subjectivity, of one's enfleshed subjectivity, thus moving away from a ratio-centered understanding of the self and accepting material embeddedness. There are various instances.
Annie, sorry. How much time do you need? Because at 4:05 we need to have a very brief break and maybe questions. Okay.
But conclude, I started a bit later. I think that's
okay.
But.
Sorry for interruption, but
it was like the talk was like meant to be 26 minutes, but yeah.
Okay. But maybe anybody want to ask question? Manage please your time for questions.
So I will probably just skip the part that talks about local ontogenealogies because the article is much longer, and basically what I wanted to conclude with is that we need to look into not only for example, that within those societies where other alternate genealogies might be already dominating, but also within ourselves and the societies of the global north, and especially also within the societies of the post-Soviet space, which includes also Latvia, and to look for those practices and attitudes that are already experienced as different from the dominating views, because as many environmental humanities scholars highlight, there's a big problem with universalization, not only in actual socio-political context, but also in scholarly contexts, because if we always just elaborate the critique, which is also the slide that I'm showing right now, if we only talk about the critique of this one dominating genealogy that is usually highlighted, then we cannot move away from that. And we actually somehow, via this paradoxical turn of events, we kind of strengthen it in that, because we basically tell the readers that this is what they are experiencing. So that's, I guess that's also it, and I won't read the rest of the paper now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we will move to the question, the next report, Stella Villarmea, University of Oxford, United Kingdom, Capacity and Autonomy During Labor, Unveiling Stereotypes in Birth. Are you, Stella, are you here? Do you hear us? Yeah.
Yes,
But I suppose, Stella, that you are an international person, not only United Kingdom, yes? Are you from Spain? Yeah. I remember you from the previous congresses. It's very nice to meet you again. Thank you.
Yeah. And to meet you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember so well. That was in Alcalá, near Madrid.
Yeah, yeah.
14. And yes, I am now based in Oxford. From September, I will be based in Madrid at Complutense University of Madrid. It's been a career with different exchanges. Shall I share? Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Okay.
We are ready. Here you go.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Katarina. Thank you all. Defining the future, rethinking the past of the International Association of Women Philosophers at the University of Paderborn. My talk is entitled Capacity and Autonomy During Labor, Unveiling Stereotypes in Childbirth. It has been assigned to this section on environment, and well, yes, why not? Environment is defined as the surroundings or conditions in which a person, animal, or plant lives or operates. And it is usually also defined as referring or meaning the natural world, especially as affected by human activity. In both these meanings, childbirth is related to environment. First, because it is the first surrounding or condition in which a person lives, and also because birth is a natural world which is affected by human activity. So this talk will be talking about those two senses. I do philosophy of birth. I use the tools of philosophy to analyze experiences and practices around childbirth. Today I will talk on the environment in which many women give birth and many of our babies are born. So let's begin. Can you confirm you can see the slide?
Only first slide.
Only what, sorry?
The first slide.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, That's this the only one. Thank you. That's it. So I'm moving it now.
Yes.
Birth care brings to the fore fascinating philosophical questions relating to knowledge, freedom, and what it means to be a human being. We hear it once and again. I've never felt so irrelevant in my life. No one advocated for me. No one listened to me on that day. Those are two testimonies I'm just bringing here that we heard just last week, in a webinar I organized at the University of Oxford for the network for values-based practice in childbirth that we have been launching. So you can listen to the full testimonies because they are accessible in YouTube, and you will just need to search for women's choices in childbirth. Really? I bring those testimonies, but I could bring so many. It's hard to believe, isn't it? And yet we hear it in personal conversations, peer group exchanges, professional meetings on birth care. Many women are shocked that their rights over their own bodies remain contested even today. Of course, there are many caring healthcare professionals out there who are compassionate and follow a good practice and the law, true. But I will be talking today about situations where this is not the case, about why women's rights are actually and frequently breached during birth, during childbirth, and about how obstetric violence takes place. The recent UN Special Report on Violence Against Women from 2019, this is a report that is issued every year, and the last one, or the one in 2019, was focusing on abuses during facility-based childbirth, that is, childbirth that takes place at centers, at health centers. The United Nations report reveals that mistreatment and violence against women in childbirth happen around the world and affect women across all socioeconomic levels. It's like gender violence, it's a type of gender violence. At the heart of international documents is a call to arms for women-centered care and values-based practice in childbirth. However, I argue, this process of change has reached a certain impasse because it operates under a medical model that does not pay attention to how women view rationality and agency in childbirth. Insofar as these notions, rationality, agency, are central to what counts as being human, this debate is of profound philosophical import. Today, I would like to present one example of this kind of import, unveiling the stereotype, capacity and autonomy during labor, or should I better say it as a question, capacity, autonomy during labor? Within maternity care, there is a fundamental problem, which is that while everybody is clear that choice, women's autonomy, and agency are fundamental in theory and in the law, in practice, this is often, if not regularly, not enacted. Women's experience speaks to an uncomfortable truth, namely that autonomy in decision-making about their body and health during labor is far from commonplace, and that obstetric violence has to be addressed. So while pregnant women and people in labor are autonomous and in full capacity citizens according to the law, they are not always considered as such in clinical practice. And I am interested in exploring what the tension between the law and the practice exactly is. Of course, we can always mention time, money, and service pressures as reasons, and they should play their part. But philosophy can help us acknowledge that the obstacles to enhance capacity and autonomy during labor lie also at yet another layer that is not structural but conceptual, for it has to do with our notions of what capacity and autonomy are. Consciously or unconsciously, professionals do not always engage in true shared decision making with women during labor because they take us to be obviously not in full capacity. And why are women in labor obviously not in full capacity? because their being in an altered state of body and consciousness is taken to deeply affect their capacity to retain and recall information and balance it in coming to a decision. So what they say is taken to not necessarily mean what they say is taken to not necessarily convey what they mean, nor what they need, nor what is good for them and their babies. In short, women subject to the uterine influence do not reason well. Stereotypes can play themselves out in the unconscious bias we all share concerning women in labor as irrational, and which is the most frequent and probably most influential stereotype about women giving birth, that they are not rational, that they behave irrationally. From this perspective, the debate on women's rationality, choices, and decision-making in childbirth is a pressing battlefield. At stake is nothing less than women's entitlement to full citizenship. And it is very important for me to mention that I am addressing rationality because in labor, in birth, because rationality is a keystone in our social contract, in the way we regulate our civic practices. And it is also very important in health matters and in the way we are treated or conceived or approached when we are in health centers. So the point is that if a contract, if one has to be a fully entitled subject, one has to be in full capacity to be able to engage in most of the situations, to just say, in the hospital, it matters very, very much that women in labor are taken not to be in capacity, even if by the law they are, because no one is not in capacity unless proved to be so. There is this enormous, huge gap that would not be acceptable in any other areas of medicine, but that happens in birth care with total spontaneity, or let's say it's obvious. And that is why I'm bringing the topic of rationality, not because I want or don't want to describe women in labor as being rational or not, but because unless we have this clear, we don't have clear what is going on in terms of our rights. So I can say more maybe later on. In what follows, I would like to take a philosophical approach to explaining how we can protect women's rights during childbirth. And to that aim, I focus on the role of implicit bias and gender stereotypes in maternity care. Implicit bias is defined as the attitudes or the stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Research on implicit bias suggests that while we may typically lack conscious access to the source of implicit attitudes and their impact in our beliefs and behavior, we do have access to their content. So without beating around the bush, we know what we think, even if we don't know why we think it. For those who are familiar with the history of ideas and the feminist analysis that help illuminate it, there are too many covertly active associations in the discourses and practices around childbirth not to be noticed. It takes awareness to ultimately challenge those assumptions, and philosophy has an invaluable role to play in uncovering such gender narratives. A woman in labor far from embodies the typical idea or supposed characteristics of a rational agent. One of those rational agents that economic theory has fallen in love for, and we saw in Julius Nelson's keynote talk the other day. But rationality, which relates to reason, is more than, say, comparing stock market values to decide where to invest your money. For example, the woman in labor who decides she wants to get up and move around is indeed also rational, since in order to find an appropriate birthing position, she evaluates the resources and options available to her. Everyday philosophy calls this practical reasoning, or as Kant would say, practical use of reason, which involves life experience. I'm reminded that nature documentaries view chimpanzees piling up boxes to reach bananas as a proof of a cognitive learning process, while the decisions a woman takes to find a good birthing position are not recognized as a cognitive process. How is it that chimpanzees show a spark of intelligence by climbing on boxes, but the woman moving around during labor is simply following her animal instincts? And I'm conscious that I'm talking to the audience that is learned and wise and experienced in all these tensions, but also in the stereotypes behind them, underneath them. Here you see the title of the slide is Cry is a Cry is a Cry is a Cry, which I wrote as a paraphrasis of the American novelist Gertrude Stein's sentence, "Rose is a rose, is a rose, is a rose." The sentence helps me introduce another example of a stereotypical or implicit biased thinking in the case of a woman in labor, the interpretation of her cry. A laboring woman's cry is usually considered non-rational behavior, a sign that she has lost control. However, it may be that a woman crying out during labor is being more rational, more prudent in the Aristotelian sense than we think. Ultimately, perhaps her cry is premeditated. After all, a woman in labor is from another world. She's keenly aware that our culture interprets the heart-rending cry of a birthing woman as a paradigm for total loss of control. You only need to watch the films. Consequently, in our context, many women who have been educated by the time, educated in a social context, of course, by the time they give birth, think very carefully before releasing loud cries, not to mention that they may prefer not to be a nuisance, another typical learned reaction which demonstrates a certain medical socialization. For these reasons, it takes courage. The first cry, it takes guts to try it out, see what happens, and if it seems good, to continue. Good, of course, in relation to what it is actually being attempted, that is, giving birth. But it may be simply that a woman in labor knows, and I use knows, her cry will help her because she has learned that guttural sounds emitted from one's throat open the birth canal. There is a direct connection between the muscles of the throat and those of the pelvis. Opera singers learn that controlling their pelvic floor helps them reach some of the highest or lowest notes. If this is the case, we will need to start admitting, as hard as it may be, that women may learn in antenatal classes, in conversations with friends or families, that crying out may help them. When the moment arrives, they try it out and it helps. And that is why they continue. They choose, test, evaluate, and confirm, pure method. Why are we so reluctant to acknowledge what they do is rational? Ludwig Wittgenstein explained that the meaning of a sign cannot be innately interpreted. Rather, a sign needs the context of social practices to realize its meaning. So the color red does not mean anything without a context. It only means stop when it shows in a light, in a traffic light, under our driving law. A cry uttered during labor need not be any different. The crying is a sign of something. The patriarchal context interprets it as a lack of control, but the interpretative context may be different. We may interpret the sound as a way of maintaining the rhythm of breathing and working through pain. Among humans, a cry or guttural sound can have many interpretations. It can be an order, a limit, a lament, a vindication, an impact, a mantra, an expression of relief or pleasure, to mention a few. Why should it not also be an intentional action that opens up an organ to facilitate entry to a unique existential space? Of course, and this is basic, there are contexts or moments in which the laboring woman's cry means something else, which is why it is so important to remember that the cry is a sign. The cry can, for example, signify that the birthing person is expressing her fear or anxiety, her complaint, her protest. Or it might be the way she asks for an epidural. There are even contexts in which the person crying out, the person learning to cry out, is the husband or partner in a striking and emotional projection of empathy or solidarity, as it is a ritual in certain tribes of the Amazon. And it would be very interesting to reflect on this empathetic sharing of cry as some paths of thought. But let me move on. There are many interpretations. For example, further on during labor, a cry might cease being rational behavior in the sense of being premeditated to connect a means towards an end, or as a learned resource, with lack at a certain point during labor, even if it is the first labor. Behavior which started for cultural reasons enters a distinct and different or interesting phase that I would refer here, for simplicity's sake, as physiological. Once a woman has tested the virtues of her cry, once she's confident of its value and has used it to transition to the next stage of labor, her scream might become something else. For example, a tool for navigation, or a loud mantra for concentration. Then her crying signals that everything is going well. She feels safe to land on planet Earth, a notion that refers to women's descriptions of being or entering into another time zone, space, or even world during labor. In those contexts, screaming during labor, this moment I'm telling, screaming during labor, far from meaning that the woman is out of herself, it rather means she is in herself. And remember that birth pain is the only pain whose utterance does not necessarily mean that something is wrong or has to be amended. It's independent. Think of the sound that soldiers make on the battlefield. Initially, battle cries may be chants designed to motivate, then shouts to encourage speed, later for focus, and finally the sound of the enemy being targeted. We would not routinely consider soldiers as behaving irrationally when they let out this final cry. We would be more inclined to think of their final sound as fulfilling a function, an appropriate means to achieve a desired end. Let us compare this with how easily in some contexts the birthing woman's sounds are taken to mean just one thing, that she has lost control and perhaps even her capacity, which is the point. Or consider the way in which in some cultures the pain of grieving for lost loved ones is signified by silent behavior when in public, while in other cultures, mourning is accompanied by, or even requires, heartbreaking screams and loud wails. Why are we more inclined to think of women's, by the way, birthing language as less cultural than, say, men's mourning language? As humans, birthing women do the same things or are similar to each other. However, the same or similar scream has different meanings depending on the prevailing culture, situation, lifestyle, language game, or worldview where we live, and who, where, when, and for what purpose the scream is uttered. The scream of the birthing woman is tuned into a specific culture and context and should be interpreted within both. We must challenge, I would like to challenge the university of birthing behavior to allow different and better interpretations in context, to reduce the multiplicity of meanings and application of labor sounds to a simplistic "she does not have capacity" is a sign of patriarchy. We need to address the multiplicity of voices in childbirth, their autonomy and agency, and we can advance this by using knowledge in the area of embodied philosophy. And that is what it means to say that the birthing woman's cry is a sign, it's a sign, it's a sign. As you see, I have analyzed the capacity and autonomy of birthing women to reveal gender-implicit biases in birth care. And my approach seeks to break down the silos that have existed historically between women's health and philosophical thinking. Women frequently have their rights breached during childbirth. That is what the international organizations have proved. And we need to know why this happens before we can fix it effectively. My research takes this approach to explain how we can protect women's rights during childbirth, principally in analyzing how much of birth care continues to underestimate the capacity of a woman in labor to be a fully entitled subject. If you're interested, I am conducting 2 research projects in the philosophy of birth with funding from Complutense University, the University of Oxford, and the European Commission. And please get in touch if you are interested in exploring future collaborations. And these are some of my publications so that you see what is the surrounding lines at the moment. One is, I will start with the second. There is a line that goes back into the history of medicine. That's the article on Casanova, Giacomo Casanova, and the philosophy of birth that has been published in Hypatia. There is another line that goes into current practices. This article, when a uterus comes in the door, reason goes out the window. That is talking about vaginal examinations without consent during labor. And then another one that is goes into what is actual practice. It's co-written with Brenda Kelly, an obstetrician. There's barriers to establishing shared decision-making in childbirth. The article where I have been able to kind of gather many thoughts, and which is more of a panoramic, is the first one, A Philosophy of Birth. If you want to change the world, change the conversation, which is now ready to be published. Well, this should be the end. Please contact me if you want to exchange at any of this, for example, this email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very, very interesting aspect and approach. Yeah, really. Yes, we are very happy.